When investigators finally accessed Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker data, they weren't expecting it to change much. At most, it was supposed to confirm the timeline everyone had already been working with. But that's not what happened. According to sources close to the case, the data raised questions almost immediately. At a time when Nancy was believed to be resting, her heart activity showed sudden changes, sharp enough to stand out, but not easy to explain. One analyst reportedly pointed out that the pattern didn't fully align with the sequence of events that had been documented so far. And that's where things started to get complicated. Because up until this point, the case followed a fairly straightforward narrative. Nancy was last seen at home, everything appeared normal, and then she was gone. No clear signs of disturbance, no confirmed struggle, nothing that clearly pointed in one direction. But now, with this new data, investigators may be looking at a timeline that isn't as simple as it once seemed. And if the timeline doesn't hold, then some of the earlier assumptions might need to be reconsidered. Before this new development, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie was already drawing quiet but steady attention. Not because it was chaotic or filled with obvious clues, but because it was the opposite. Everything about Nancy's life followed a pattern. Neighbors described her as consistent, someone who didn't break routine without a reason. She kept regular hours, stayed in touch with the same small circle of people, and wasn't known for sudden decisions or unexpected behavior. The kind of person whose absence is noticed immediately. So when she was reported missing, the first reaction wasn't confusion, it was concern. Early reports suggested that nothing inside the home looked out of place. There were no clear signs of forced entry, no visible struggle, and no immediate evidence pointing toward a specific incident. On the surface, it seemed like a disappearance without a clear trigger. Investigators initially focused on building a timeline based on what was known. When was Nancy last seen? Who spoke to her last? What activity could be confirmed? For a while, that timeline appeared stable, simple, even. But behind the scenes, it wasn't that straightforward. Some details didn't fully line up. Not major contradictions, but small gaps. Moments that couldn't be clearly verified. Periods of time where there was no solid confirmation of what actually happened. At first, those gaps didn't raise alarms. In many cases, small inconsistencies are expected. But as time passed, those same gaps became harder to ignore. At the same time, attention slowly shifted toward the people closest to Nancy. Not because there was direct evidence against anyone, but because in cases like this, investigators often start with what's familiar. Publicly, everything remained controlled. Statements were measured, updates were limited, and nothing suggested a major breakthrough. But privately, according to sources, the investigation was becoming more uncertain. Because the more they tried to confirm the timeline, the more they realized parts of it were based on assumptions rather than clear evidence. And that uncertainty is exactly what made the pacemaker data so important. Not because it gave immediate answers, but because it had the potential to either confirm the timeline or quietly challenge it. The direction of the case began to shift the moment investigators stopped relying only on statements and started looking at the data more closely. Up until then, most of what they had came from interviews, timelines, and assumptions built around routine. It wasn't unusual. In many cases, that's how the early stages work. You gather accounts, you line them up, and you try to form a sequence that makes sense. And for a while, it did. Nancy was believed to have been at home during a specific window of time. Nothing out of the ordinary was reported. No calls for help, no noise complaints, no visible signs that anything had gone wrong. But as the investigation continued, that version of events started to feel incomplete. According to sources familiar with the review process, one of the first concerns raised internally wasn't about what was found, but about what was missing. There were stretches of time where nothing could be clearly confirmed. No activity, no witnesses, no digital footprint that could confidently fill the gap. At first, that didn't seem unusual. But the longer those gaps remained unexplained, the more they stood out. So investigators began rechecking everything. Not just the obvious evidence, but the smaller details that might have been overlooked. That's when attention turned to Nancy's pacemaker data. Initially, it wasn't seen as a key piece of evidence. It was considered supplementary, something that might support the existing timeline, not challenge it. But once the data was reviewed more closely, that assumption started to change. According to internal discussions, the readings showed patterns that didn't fully align with what investigators believed had happened. At a time when Nancy was expected to be inactive, her heart activity showed noticeable variation. Not constant, not extreme, but enough to suggest that something was happening. One analyst reportedly pointed out that the changes weren't random. They appeared in intervals, short bursts followed by brief returns to normal. That detail mattered. Because if those readings were accurate, it suggested Nancy may not have been completely still during that time. And that's where the first real conflict emerged. Because the timeline being used by investigators didn't account for any movement, interaction, or disruption during that period. So now they were facing two possibilities. Either the timeline was missing something, or the data was being misinterpreted. Neither option was simple. As the analysis continued, another detail started to stand out. The timing of the variations didn't just exist, they seemed to align with the very gap investigators had been unable to explain. That overlap raised new questions. If the only unexplained portion of the timeline also contained unexplained biological activity, then the two couldn't be treated separately anymore. They had to be connected in some way. And once that idea was considered, the entire case started to feel less stable. Because up until that moment, the investigation had been built on a structure that assumed consistency. Each piece of information supported the next. Now, that structure had a point of tension. Internally, discussions reportedly became more cautious. Not because there was a clear answer, but because there wasn't. Some investigators began questioning whether earlier assumptions had been accepted too quickly. Others warned that the data alone couldn't confirm what actually happened. But the concern remained the same. If the timeline didn't fully match the available data, then something, some detail, some moment, had not been properly accounted for. And that's when the first real twist started to take shape. Because it wasn't just about what the data showed. It was about what the timeline failed to explain. For the first time, the case wasn't just dealing with missing information. It was dealing with conflicting information. And once that kind of conflict appears in an investigation, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads into every assumption, every statement, every detail that was once considered reliable. Because now, the question wasn't just what happened to Nancy. The question had become much more complicated. Which version of events was actually closer to the truth, and which one wasn't? As the review continued, the focus shifted from whether the data mattered to how much it might be changing the picture. Internally, investigators began taking a more careful look at the sequence of readings, not just the spikes themselves, but the way they appeared over time. What stood out wasn't a single irregular moment, but a pattern that seemed to build in short phases. According to sources, that pattern didn't fully match a scenario where someone is completely at rest. At the same time, it also didn't clearly point to one specific cause. It sat in an uncomfortable middle ground, noticeable enough to raise questions, but not definitive enough to explain them. That uncertainty is what pushed the case into a more sensitive phase. Because once the data was compared side by side with the existing timeline, the gap investigators had been struggling with became harder to dismiss. The overlap between the two, unexplained time and unexplained activity, was now too clear to ignore. At that point, discussions reportedly expanded beyond the original assumptions. Some investigators began considering whether the timeline needed to be adjusted. Others questioned whether key details had been interpreted too narrowly in the early stages. And a few raised a more difficult possibility, that something during that missing window had not been fully recognized for what it was. Then came a detail that made things even more complicated. According to one internal note, there was an additional segment in the data that showed a more sustained irregular pattern, longer than the earlier variations and more consistent in its structure. It didn't look like a brief reaction. It looked like a sequence. That distinction mattered. Because a sequence suggests continuity, something happening over a period of time, not just a single moment. And that's where the tone of the investigation began to shift. Not toward conclusions, but toward caution. Because if that segment truly aligns with the same unexplained window, then it suggests that whatever occurred during that time may have been more involved than initially believed. At this stage, no official conclusion has been announced. But internally, one concern seems to be guiding everything forward. If the data reflects a longer, more complex sequence of events, then the original timeline may not be telling the full story. As soon as details about the pacemaker data began circulating, the reaction wasn't immediate, but it didn't take long to build. At first, it showed up in small discussions. Online forums, comment sections, a few independent creators asking careful questions about how medical data is used in investigations. Most of it was measured, even cautious. But then the conversation started to spread. Within days, clips, posts, and threads began focusing on one central idea. If the data doesn't fully align with the timeline, what does that mean for everything else? That question alone was enough to divide opinion. On one side, people saw the development as a significant shift. Not proof of anything specific, but a reason to reconsider earlier assumptions. Many pointed out that in complex cases, new types of evidence can change how timelines are understood. On the other side, there was clear pushback. Medical professionals and analysts began emphasizing that pacemaker data can be difficult to interpret without full context. Variations in heart activity don't automatically indicate a specific event, and drawing direct conclusions from patterns alone can be misleading. That contrast between possibility and caution quickly shaped the broader discussion. Media coverage reflected the same balance. Some outlets framed the development as a potential turning point, highlighting how emerging data might reopen questions. Others focused more on the limitations, stressing that without official confirmation, the information should be treated carefully. Meanwhile, people connected to the case remained largely quiet. That silence didn't go unnoticed. For some, it was seen as standard procedure during an ongoing review. For others, it added to the sense that important details were still being worked through behind the scenes. And as the discussion continued, one theme kept coming up again and again. Not what the data proves, but what it challenges. Because even without a clear conclusion, the idea that part of the timeline might need to be reconsidered was enough to keep the conversation active. And with no official clarification yet, that conversation is only getting louder. Just when the discussion online started to settle into two clear sides, those who believed the data was important, and those who warned against reading too much into it, a new detail surfaced that changed the tone of everything again. It didn't come through official channels. No press briefing, no confirmed statement. Instead, it appeared in fragmented claims shared by people who described themselves as familiar with internal discussions around the review process. According to these unverified accounts, there was an additional layer in the pacemaker data that hadn't been part of the initial interpretation. A secondary sequence, subtle, less obvious, but still present when analyzed under a different lens. What made it stand out wasn't intensity. It was structure. The pattern reportedly showed a progression over time, rather than isolated moments. Not random spikes, not disconnected activity, but a flow that suggested something unfolding in stages. And that's where the conversation shifted again. Because if that interpretation holds any weight, then the earlier understanding of the timeline might only be capturing fragments of what actually happened. Even more unsettling for some observers was the timing of this alleged sequence. It appeared to align with a window in the case where official records are still unclear, marked as unverified or incomplete in early summaries. That overlap reopened questions that investigators had already begun carefully setting aside. But now, those questions were back on the table. Was that period truly quiet, or simply unobserved? Was the lack of information a gap in evidence, or a gap in interpretation? Inside online discussions, theories multiplied quickly. Some argued this reinforced the idea that key moments may not have been fully understood at the time. Others pushed back harder, calling the new claims speculative and warning that fragmented data can easily be misread when viewed without full context. And once again, the case split into uncertainty. No official confirmation has been given about the existence of this secondary sequence. No agency has clarified whether the interpretation is accurate, incomplete, or entirely incorrect. But the silence around it has only intensified attention. Because now, the situation is no longer just about what the data shows. It's about what might still be hidden inside it. And as more analysts reportedly return to re-examine the original logs, one question is beginning to dominate every discussion. If there really is another layer to this data, how much of the story are we still not seeing? At this point, the case is no longer just about missing pieces or unclear timelines. It's about interpretation, trust, and how much weight we give to new kinds of evidence. Because what we've seen so far raises a very uncomfortable question. If even small sections of data can shift how an entire timeline is understood, then how confident can we really be in the version we started with? And that's where your opinion actually matters. Do you think the Pacemaker data is a genuine breakthrough that could reshape the direction of this case? Or do you believe this is a situation where technical information is being overanalyzed and taken out of context? There's no simple answer here, and that's exactly why this discussion keeps growing. Some people are convinced that these patterns point towards something investigators may have missed in the early stages. Others feel strongly that without official confirmation, everything being discussed remains speculation, and treating it as more than that could lead to misunderstandings. But regardless of which side you're on, one thing is clear. This case is not being ignored. It's being watched, analyzed, and debated from every angle. And as more information continues to circulate, more questions are likely to appear. Now I want to hear from you.